Good afternoon and greetings from the Kluge Center at the Library of Congress. Thank you for joining us today. I'm Brent Iacobucci, Acting Kluge Director. The Kluge Center was founded in 2000 thanks to a generous donation from philanthropist John W. Kluge. The center brings scholars and researchers from around the world to Capitol Hill to use the library's vast collections and to interact with and inform policymakers and the public. We also administer the Kluge Prize for the achievement in the study of humanity, which will be awarded this summer. This is the 9th installment in our Pillars of Democracy series, where we examine challenges facing major institutions in American society. This series is jointly sponsored by the American Enterprise Institute, the Brookings Institution, and the Kluge Center. Prior discussions address institutions including the US Congress, the military, political parties, and the media. Those prior conversations are available on our website. On June 17th, our final discussion will cover universities and academia. Today, we will focus on churches and other civic institutions. I'd like to thank our panelists for taking the time to join us today. We have Dave Campbell, the Packey J.D. Professor of American Democracy at the University of Notre Dame. Dave's research focuses on civic and political engagement, particularly on religion and secularism among young people. We also have Theda Skocpol, the Victor S. Thomas Professor of Government and Sociology at Harvard University and a member of the Kluge Center Scholars Council. Her work covers a wide range of topics, including healthcare reform, public policy, and civic engagement. Andy Smerick is a senior fellow at the Manhattan Institute, focusing on education, civil society, and American conservatism. Our discussion today will be moderated by Wes Granberg-Michelson. Wes, a minister of the Reformed Church in America, served as general secretary for the church for 17 years, and in 2012, he was a distinguished visiting scholar at the Kluge Center. And now, Wes, would you like to lead our discussion?
Thank you very much, Brent, and again, welcome to all of you. We've got three extraordinary panelists here, and I want to be able to allow those of you who are joining us to get to know them a little bit better as they describe their area of focus. So in all that is involved in civil society and religion, and as those impact broader society, I'd like each one of you to focus on what most concerns you, where's your work, and what is grabbing your attention and what are you seeing? I want to start with Dave and then go to Theda and then go to Andy. So Dave, describe what your particular work is as we begin this panel.
Well, thank you for that introduction, and thank you to the Library of Congress and Brookings and AEI for sponsoring this very important series. We are at an unprecedented moment as we grapple with the future of American democracy. And so it's great to have these kinds of conversations and get people all over the country thinking about just what is the state of American democracy. To answer your question, Wes, there are of course lots of things I could point to, but let me focus on one of the major themes, I think, for this discussion, which is the role of churches or more broadly, religious congregations and religion and its role in civil society. This is something that I have worked on, looked at, researched over a number of years. And roughly 10 years ago, if you'd asked me about the connection between religion and civil society, I would have said, well, we've seen a decline in many other types of voluntary associations in the US, but religion is largely, at that time, it seemed, immune to that. Religion seemed to be sort of holding on to its place in civil society. And that was largely a positive. This is something we can get into. It's not as though we should paint with a broad brush and say that religion is all good or all bad when it comes to fostering democratic virtues and such things. But, you know, on the whole, it seemed like religion was a good thing. It would foster a sense of civic engagement among people, and congregations often serve to bring people from different backgrounds together and give them an opportunity to wrestle with important questions in a fairly safe environment. Well, I no longer can say that religion seems to be largely immune from many of the other trends we've seen, as we've seen the decline of all sorts of voluntary associations in America. And the reason that we've seen the decline in church going, church membership, people's affiliation with religion is especially troubling because the cause of that is quite distinct from what we've seen in other spheres of civil society. While this isn't the only reason, one of the primary reasons that people are fleeing religion is because they see religion as an extension of politics, and specifically partisan politics. And many Americans have an allergic reaction to that mixture of religion and partisan politics. And so when they see that happen, when they see that combination, they don't want to be a part of their local congregation. They don't want to think of themselves as being a member of a denomination. They don't want to think of themselves as being religious. And that, I think, is very troubling, because whatever your position might be on the good or bad of religion's role in civil society, the fact that this one institution has become so politicized that it's causing a number of people to leave it really reduces religion's ability to contribute to civil society, and really just enables it to kind of reinforce the kind of partisan polarization that we see in so many other aspects of American life. So a lot more I can say on that theme, but let me just pause there because we want to get.
I'm sure we'll want to return to that, Dave. Thanks very much. Now, Theda, the extraordinary work that you've done over the course of your career, where do you focus your attention most in your work as you look at voluntary organizations and all that they contribute? Theda, I think you're muted, Theda.
Let me echo what Dave said about how grateful we all are for this chance to have a discussion and to include people in the public. And I look forward to that discussion, part of the discussion. My own work, I think the first thing people need to realize about me is I tend to look at things over the long run. And even when I study the present, I try to put it in the perspective of the long run. So I come at this whole question of civil society, having worked with colleagues to identify and track the ups and downs over almost 200 years of large voluntary associations in America, meaning those that 1% or more of American adults joined. And those just blossomed to an extraordinary degree in the era between the Civil War of the 1860s and the mid 20th century. And our findings about the 58 large groups, not including political parties or churches that we identified, were just some things that I keep in mind as a benchmark for understanding what is changing now. What we found out about that civic world, that classic American civic world, is that people joined voluntarily, they paid dues, they tended to go to local meetings once a week, once every 2 weeks, once a month, in a whole variety of male-only groups, female-only groups, and occasional male and female. Some of the temperance groups were both. Even some of them bridged races, although most of classic American civic life brought people together, ranging from the rich and the privileged to the working people in the same associations, but segregated people by gender and race and ethnic identifications. These groups had national parts, state or regional parts, and local parts, so they connected the various levels in an up and down and up way. And because they depended on member dues for their resources and member enthusiasm and participation, they couldn't get too far away from what large numbers of Americans were prepared to accept in terms of community involvement. They often mixed people from different political parties. They were often somewhat different in different parts of the country according to the mores of those regions of the country. Well, then we get to the 1960s, to the current period, and starting in the 1960s, this federated, membership-based, cross-class world went into sharp decline, especially in the areas other than churches. And instead, we got a proliferation of professionally run advocacy groups with headquarters in Washington and New York that wielded money and ideas and lobbying and lawsuits. And things that continued to happen locally were often not connected up to those national centers. Well, more recently, I've had a chance to study the upsurges of grassroots organizing, including groups that meet, that happened in the Tea Party after Barack Obama was elected, And then again, to an extraordinary degree, after Donald Trump was elected 8 years later. And lo and behold, about 3,000 regularly meeting local groups all over the country emerged in both of those movements. But notice that they were a little bit different. They were connected immediately to national events. They were part of the polarization by ideology and in some ways race that we see now. And they don't have the same kind of staying power or moderating influence that a lot of classic American civic associations had on public debates and on community, tackling community problems at the local and state and national level. So I'm interested in understanding how our world is changing. I mean, we've got the rise of much more individualistic and expressive, angry expressive forms of engagement in the social media era. But even the remaining groups that form and meet are not as separate from the extreme polarized ideological debates that we see in our national media and in our national professional advocacy sectors as they used to be in the past.
Thank you very much, Theda. Now, Andy, I want to hear from you. You had an extraordinary background, both working in administrations and then in academia. But tell us and tell the audience where your particular focus in this discussion would be.
Well, again, let me repeat what my colleagues have said and thank everyone for having us here. It's a real pleasure to talk with you, but also about this subject. So 3 quick things to start off. Number 1 is I'm probably maybe the person in this field who brings the most sunshine. There are lots of reasons to be discouraged, but from my experience, there are so many reasons to be happy about what is happening in civic life today. And I distinguish it from what I see in the online world, what I see in Washington, D.C., inside of the Beltway. Every single day, thousands, tens of thousands, millions of Americans go about the work of working with their parishes, with their PTAs, with the American Legion, with all of these different types of organizations, and they just stay focused on their communities. They don't care about Twitter, they don't care about Instagram, they don't care about getting famous. They just do the work of helping their neighbors. And because media has changed so much over the past decade, certainly 20 years, the angriest voices, the most online voices in institutions have a tendency to get the most publicity. And so I think Americans have been distracted, or in some cases, we're being gaslit to believe that all American institutions are the kinds that we see on Fox News or MSNBC or on Twitter, when in fact, that represents a very small portion of civic life in America. Go to any community, the library is doing great stuff. People are working for social service organizations. They're starting new schools. So I never want people to lose fact of the sight that below the radar, not on Twitter, not on cable news, not on podcasts, great people are doing great things for their communities. Less so than probably in the past, but still that exists. So that's number 1. Number 2 is I think we need, I like to talk about like a moral framework, a historical framework for thinking about these organizations and how they function in society. And I've been writing more and more about the Catholic social doctrine concept of subsidiarity, which some people think of as just decentralization, but it's way more than that. It's about the proper allocation of duties and powers, responsibilities, authorities across different entities within society, from individuals all the way up through mediating bodies to the federal government. And it seems to me that we have lost the language of talking about why these mediating organizations are important. Like the earliest popes who were writing about this with subsidiarity 100 years ago were aware of this. Robert Nisbet was aware of it. But we just talk too little, I think, about the importance of individuals joining organizations, of organizations being the first line of defense for families who are in need, providing a bulwark against the state and so forth. So these organizations are important as a theoretical matter, and subsidiarity is something that I've been writing a lot about. It's a way of organizing the thoughts. And the final point I'll raise is I would like more people to realize how our current interest in diversity and inclusion should intersect with our conversations about civil society mediating bodies. E pluribus unum doesn't mean homogenize. It doesn't mean make everybody the same and everyone gets along. pluribus is important. The differences among us are important. And the way you do that in America, a continental republic that is founded in liberty and is as diverse as you could imagine, you have to allow different people to have different senses of solidarity, different ways of organizing themselves, different ways of contributing. And so they feel included in things. And the way we can do that is not by pushing everybody into big national organizations, but making sure, to quote George H.W. Bush, that there are 1,000 points of light. There's a constellation of different types of organizations. That kind of diversity is important for America, and is important for our sense of solidarity, our safety, our sense of inclusion in American society. I'll stop there.
That's great, Andy. Thank you very much. I want to go back to you, Dave, and press a little bit more on how the changes you see are really affecting democracy. You said that people are leaving religion because they see it's politicized. But on the other hand, you've done enough research to know that that represents one segment of the church, and there are others who, in fact, are maintaining their own vitality and witness. Overall, how do you see the changes in religious life as having an effect on the democratic framework we live in?
Well, let me agree with you, Wes. When I characterize people leaving religion for political purposes, obviously that's a broad statement, and there are many exceptions to that. And of course, there's many exceptions to the idea that an individual congregation or a larger denomination is wrapped up in partisan politics. Many are not. Sort of echoing what Andy was saying, actually, I would say most Americans who attend a religious congregation of whatever faith, they attend it not for any political purpose at all. That's not what they're looking for in religion. They're looking for something else. And so they go and they, find fulfillment there. And along the way, they build community, and they often are able to come together with their fellow believers to get things done that maybe extend beyond the walls of their congregation. So it is important to recognize that there is a great diversity in American religion, and there's a lot of innovation. And I'll just say that to echo what Theda was saying about looking at the long arc of history, the story of religion in America has always been a story of innovation. And every time it appeared as though America was about to turn into a more secular country, something happened to lead to what are often called great awakenings, or in the 1970s, we had the emergence of evangelical Protestantism, or it existed, but it sort of grew in strength and prominence as kind of a mini awakening. What's different today is, first of all, the depths of the secularization really seem to be much greater than we've seen in the past. And secondly, while it is not new for American religions to be involved in politics, that's been true since the Revolution. What is different today is the mixture of religion and partisan politics, to the extent that many Americans will view maybe not all religion, but certainly strands of it, particularly white evangelical Protestantism, as merely an extension of partisan politics. And I'll even be blunter, as an extension of the Republican Party. And they have good reason to believe that. And that's what they don't like. So if religion is going to be a buttressing factor, if it's going to help build civil society, it is important for religious leaders, I would say, to stay out of the partisan fray. Doesn't mean they stay out of politics. There might be issues that they speak out on, but it needs to be above partisan politics so that they're willing to criticize both sides and not be wrapped up in party politics, because that's what turns people off. And when you identify religious organizations that are doing that, I think we find that they are able to bring people together in a unique way. Religion is maybe not totally unique, but it can do some things that other civic groups are unable to, simply because of the moral voice that religious leaders can bring.
I want to press that a bit more and ask Andy about it, because yes, we hear all the time those who say they're disillusioned by the church because they don't want it to get into politics. It's hard, if you're in the Christian framework, to be a follower of Jesus and not speak about things that have a political impact, because of the nature of the history of Christian influence or witness. So this distinction you made between partisan politics, but yet still speaking to issues. I wonder, Andy, as you talk about subsidiarity and mediating institutions and so forth, do you have something further to add to that distinction that Dave has been trying to make?
Maybe, and I'm happy if he tells me that I got it all wrong, but this is the way that I think about it, is that, yes, people of faith, so I'm Catholic, and I believe, my faith tells me, but I also believe as a matter of Republican virtue that I have a duty to contribute to my society, especially the most disadvantaged. The way that I think about these civic organizations is that they are, and bear with me here, they're like the meditation of American institutions. Meditation, properly understood, is about getting people to focus on what is in front of them. It is to make sure that people take care of what is there, not have their minds spiral out into what's around the corner, what's over the horizon. Because when we do that, we worry about things. We can become polarized. We have a way of not focusing on the things that actually matter. What meditation does is say, stay in the moment, focus on the things that you can control, because that gives you agency, that gives you efficacy, and it brings out the best in you. Civic associations that are close to home enable us to do that. They allow us to act on our principles, often faith-informed, but to do something with our neighbors in mind, with our community in mind. That is, don't go on Twitter and yell about the things that you care about, some abstract concept. Don't find an avatar that you really disagree with somewhere out there in the metaverse. Join the Knights of Columbus, join the Kiwanis, start a new school, start a soup kitchen, focus on the things that actually matter to you nearby, because you have this sense of agency, efficacy, and people who have that kind of sense are the likeliest to be less anxious, less depressed, feel a better connection with people, a greater sense of solidarity. These organizations enable people to live their faith, but in a way that contributes to society, but also keeps them out of these nasty political battles. It's a whole lot harder to be angry and to yell about things when it's your neighbor that you disagree with, or when you're working side by side to try to make sure that the people who just suffered from the tornado have a roof over their head. So I think about these faith organizations, civic organizations, enabling people of faith to do the stuff that matters close to home, as opposed to getting involved in some big national conceptual abstract fight.
Okay, but I want to go back now to Theda, because your description, Theda, of what has happened to these voluntary organizations over the course of 200 years and what's happened since 1960 seemed to be a bit in contrast to what Andy described, especially as he kind of displayed the robust and vital functioning of these societies today. What are you two seeing things really differently? Do you have a response to how Andy describes what's going on in the sort of voluntary organizations that he described?
I'm going to answer that. I want to quickly make a comment about the politicization of religion. From my perspectives as a person who studied comparative history, and I've done a little bit of work about the relationship between states and churches across Western history.
Mm-hmm.
And I think the evidence is that when church leaders become closely entwined with politicians, political parties, and the state, they end up eroding the foundations of their own institutions.
Mm-hmm.
And that seems to be a lesson that some people on the hard right have now forgotten. And I predict that as the Supreme Court blesses a more and more tight relationship between certain conservative understandings of Christianity and the wielding of state power in a coercive way, that will accelerate the withdrawal of grassroots believers that they would not like to see. So I'm big on the ironies of history, and that is one that's pretty well established in comparative historical. There's a reason why religion has flourished in America, and the general separation between secular state power and religious authority that was enshrined in our Constitution actually was one of the best possible grounds for which for religion in general to flourish in America. Now, let me just say, I don't think I disagree with most of the normative things that Andy is saying. I'm not a Catholic, but I understand the subsidiary principle. For me, it's federalism. And I actually think the ways in which even secular civil society, or it was usually highly moral, most organizations in the past, even if they weren't overtly religious, and there was a close intertwining between membership associations of all kinds and various Catholics, Protestants, Jews, you name it. Most meetings of groups started with something about God and country. That kind of thing you'll now see on the right, but it was the standard fare of American civic life for a very long time, and people meant all kinds of different things by it. But even national associations used to have strong local roots so that people could come together with their neighbors to deal with each other, to get to know one another, to deal with a community crisis, to provide charitable help. I think that's still happening. I think Americans are a very giving and pitch in and do it together type people. And I think that's part of our DNA, and I don't think it's changed. The biggest threat to it is probably young people sitting around looking at their screens. But that's probably just an old lady talking. And that's the kind of thing old people do. They think it's all going to the dogs, and it probably isn't all going to the dogs. So I think that's happening. I just think it's less visible and it's less connected up to these federated structures that respect the variety at the base. Most of our national debates now are about absolutes. You've got to be all one way or all the other. Well, take an issue like abortion. Most Americans are in the middle. But we don't even find any organized groups or advocates that are pushing very hard on what most Americans would accept, which is, well, you know, make abortion rare, take care of families, but make it legal in the first trimester. That would be an enormously popular position. Because advocacy groups and national media are dominating the conversation, we're not even getting an organized expression about what most people probably think. Or to give another example, a lot of issues that have to do with what goes on in schools, they're best dealt with by people working it out. Some of these issues are very difficult. There are no absolutes about what you do with a child who questions their gender identity. It happens, and it's best dealt with in a sensitive and flexible way according to the particular school, according to the particular religious community, the realities of that family, that child. And yet we have a hard time doing that because so much has eroded in the ability of the bottom up to shape what the top down parts of our civil society do. And I would say to put limits on what they do.
Thanks. I want to go back to your first part of your comment, Theda. And, you know, I think both Andy and Dave might agree that your brief summary of what happens when church and state collude, you go all the way back to Constantine. And I think you see there the major change that happened in relationship of the church to political power that then gets expressed again and again in ways that are damaging. But I'm interested, Andy, and how you might respond to what Theda just described. Do you think that when you talk about the importance of these mediating institutions and subsidiarity and how that functions in Catholic social thought, that it means a lot of these issues really should be simply worked out at a local level?
Yeah, let me respond in two ways, because I do think there's a whole lot of agreement here, but one area that I might want to raise is something for us to talk about in the future, because there might be some disagreement. So I've made a lot of my friends in the think tank world upset over the past couple of years, because I've been trying to draw this distinction between people who talk or write about the work and people who do the work. And I think that it is very dangerous when our public discourse is dominated by people who have never been responsible for big public decisions. It is easy, in Theta's words, to think about absolutes when you just have an 800-word essay or when you're going on a podcast to talk about things. But when you're engaged in the real life work of running a shelter or of starting a school, you have to work with people, you have to accommodate, you have to be civil. The practice of public service teaches us all sorts of lessons and behaviors, skills and dispositions that enable us to work things out in ways that are invaluable for civil society, invaluable for all of society. So I think one of the solutions to today's era, getting more people to work things out, is actually getting more people involved in the business of governing, particularly governing close to home, and working in some of these close to home organizations. The second point that I would raise is we should have more conversations about what the courts have done with associations, call it since the 1950s. But there have been two books written over the past decade, one by John Inazu called Liberty's Refuge, I believe, and another one more recently by Luke Sheehan called something like Why Associations Matter, that are trying to revive the idea of rights of associations, rights of assembly. And I guess I don't view our current court as trying to tie government power to faith as much as the court recognizing that faith communities are an indispensable part of American pluralism. And so the more we can do to get courts to recognize that all of these different organizations, they can have different views from one another. Some of them can even have dissident views, but they are a legitimate part of civil society. We have to remember that the NAACP was once considered a dissident group that was not favored by the majority. The clubs that led to the American Revolution were once viewed as being hostile organizations. Organizations for women's rights were once viewed as hostile organizations. Maintaining a wide array of different types of organizations, including groups that people here wouldn't ever want to join, as long as those organizations are not fostering violence or hate, really damaging the common good, we have to have an appetite for a wide array of organizations. And I want our courts to be able to protect them, including faith-based groups.
Okay.
No, I agree with that. And the recent decision on the religious question was unanimous. I don't think that's what the new majority is about, though. But we'll just see. We'll have to wait and see.
Good. I want to press a little bit further. All three of you, in various ways, have said you've got to break this link between religion and politics, and that's damaging to our democracy for all the ways that you've enumerated. And what really, I think all of you have expressed, good things happen at local levels when people of faith are working together, and that's where the focus should be. But how would the Black church relate to that? What would you say about the witness of Martin Luther King, who felt religion had to make an impact on the public square and on policy? Or back to the Vietnam
Let me
War.
answer that, because
Yeah, sure.
I'm not arguing that religion should not be involved in politics. It always has been. And religion is not one thing. There are many strands of religion, whether we understand it in terms of doctrine or we understand it in terms of the way things are organized and who's involved in different strands of religious participation. I'm saying that marrying religious authority to state power is dangerous when state power is wielded against those who are not part of the inner circle. That's what I'm saying. And it is not simply dangerous to the people who are on the outs. It turns out to be, over time, dangerous to those who think they're furthering their faith that way.
That's a very helpful distinction.
Politics is a different matter. I think a democracy flourishes with broad participation. The question is, how do you encourage separately organized groups to work together rather than to spew hatred and demonization against one another?
I would like to ask, well, I think Theta, you've already answered, but Andy and Dave, how do you think that religion's contribution to the larger framework of society and moral imperatives that come from a religious tradition, how should that be expressed in the public sphere? What are the avenues that you feel would work, since you don't like the way in which religious figures or congregations, sort of become partisan. Yet, what shape should it take?
Well, let me actually go back to one of the examples you gave, which was of Martin Luther King.
Mhm.
Today we think of the Democratic Party and civil rights leaders as part of one single package. And so I often get the question of, well, Professor Campbell, you're worried about politicized religion. What about the civil rights movement, right? That came out of the churches, or at least churches had a big influence on what's happening in the civil rights movement. And that was very political, and that's true. But what people forget is it wasn't especially partisan. So remember at the time, when Dr. King was critical of racial policy, he was as quick to criticize Democrats as he was Republicans, because there was a pox in both houses actually at the time. If anything, if you go back far enough, it was the Republicans who were more the party of civil rights. Now that began to change obviously in the 60s, but even in the course of Martin Luther King's lifetime, it's not as though he was marching in lockstep with a Democratic administration. Today, I would actually say that the warning that I raise about politicized religion on the right is actually likely to also apply on the left, although for reasons we don't fully understand, it doesn't seem to be as alienating for people on the left. And it may be that there's just a longer history of it. And it may also be that politics on the left, as expressed through religion, doesn't have the same sort of partisan feel to it. It may effectively be as partisan, but it doesn't come off as partisan. And I should also note that, and this is extremely critical, in the research that I've done, there's a distinction between, and make sure that we get this clear, the difference between religious leaders who employ political rhetoric, so religious leaders becoming political, and political leaders who become religious or use religious rhetoric. What seems to be the most radioactive to voters is politicians who use religion. That seems to be more troubling than religious leaders who use politics, if that makes sense.
Interesting. Andy, what do you think?
I don't know how much more I can add to this, other than the way I think about this is in America, there are seemingly infinite conceptions of justice. There are people that I know and respect who think that Rawls got it all right, or that Aquinas got it all right, or that Aristotle got it all right, or that Nozick got it right, or the utilitarians or Kant got it all right. And some people increasingly on the right think that natural law or integralism has it all right. Now, I personally have views on which of those are right or wrong, but we have a wonderful way in America of sorting all these things out. And people have every right to use their motivations, their principles, their faith traditions to inform their views and then enter the public square. Well, thank goodness we have a Declaration of Independence, and we have our federal system, we have the Constitution, we have norms and institutions to bring all of those different ideas together. So we have a democratic process, we have distribution of power, so people can hash these things out, hopefully in a healthy way, and reach some sort of accommodation, some sort of solution. So I seldom balk at anybody, whether they're citing Rawls or Aquinas, if they're in the public square, because all of these things, they're big bodies of knowledge that have developed over time that are robust, that are legitimate parts of our discussion, whether they're faith-based or not. They've been pressure tested over time, and they have something that contribute to our debate. And I want all of that so we can reach good decisions. But I think I agree with my colleagues here that once there is, you're attaching government power to a faith tradition, full stop, then that kind of a war of ideas, differing principles, that kind of discussion stops. And then that is absolutely toxic for a constitutional democracy like we have. So will never find me disagreeing with Frederick Douglass or Martin Luther King or Daniel Patrick Moynihan or Ronald Reagan or Jimmy Carter, alluding to faith, much less Abraham Lincoln. They did it all the time. Less because it's a matter of faith than it is a shared body of knowledge that we can all refer back to, and that there's wisdom there.
I'd like to bring this discussion to the context that we're in right now, because we're in the wake of this terrorist shooting in Buffalo. And I've heard commentators say, what this shows is that we're at this point where the American democracy is going to discover whether you can be a genuinely multiracial society and be a genuine democracy. And that kind of sharpens the whole question behind the pillars of democracy discussion in terms of religion and civil institutions. But what do each of you think? What do each of you think that as you look at religious and civil voluntary organizations, do they have a role in making possible a democracy that is fully multiracial? And do you think that question is as pointed as some commentators are saying now? I don't know who would like to jump into that first, but I'd love to hear what all three of you would say on that. Dave?
If I could speak to that, earlier in my comments, I noted that religion is complicated. And so there are some aspects of religion that can foster greater racial harmony. And then there are other aspects of religion that can actually exacerbate racial divisions. You've no doubt heard the very famous line, often attributed to Martin Luther King, and while he repeated it often, he actually never took credit for it, that 11 a.m. on Sunday morning is the most segregated hour in America. That is less true today than it was then when he was saying it, in the 50s and 60s. But religion does continue to be quite a racially segregated institution, not legally segregated, of course, but in practice, it is often the case that people worship with those who are of the same race or ethnicity as them. Now, to say that that's often the case means that there are also exceptions to that. And so religion actually has a great promise to bring people together of different races. It's not easy to do. The Catholic Church has been grappling with this now for a generation or two, as they have had what are often called Anglo, that is, basically white English-speaking congregations or parishes, now diversifying as we've seen a larger Latino population. And, it doesn't always go smoothly, but that's an institution that at least is grappling with it. And you find examples of that in other American religions as well. To the extent that you find those very local conversations and, sometimes hard conversations happening among people of different backgrounds, that's healthy. On the other hand, there are certainly congregations around the country where what you hear from the pulpit is not helping and might actually be fomenting greater division. I don't want to overstate that. I don't actually think that's terribly common, but it's out there. And to the extent that religion is doing more of the racial mixing, so much the better. To the extent that it's fomenting division, so much the worse. My hope is that it's more the former than the latter.
Let me add some statistics to that. I mean, I'm not in the academic community the way the three of you are, but I do pay a little attention to facts. And multiracial congregations, Theda and Dave and Andy, which you can define as a congregation where 20% at least is of a different racial background than whatever the majority is. Those used to be 13% of all US congregations. Now they are 20%. 1 of 5 US congregations is multiracial, which is a trend that I think isn't, it's a sociologist who say that, but that's not being recognized or tracked enough. I wonder if it does have more hope than we might think for the challenge that we face. I go to Andy or to Theda to contribute. Maybe Andy first.
Sure. I mean, that is a hopeful indicator, and there are other hopeful indicators across society about more pluralistic, more accommodating visions, a whole lot less racism than we had a generation, certainly 2 or 3 generations ago. So I think in general, we're moving in the right direction on these issues, but this type of incident we see in Buffalo or elsewhere not just takes your breath away, but can make you discouraged about what the future holds. One thing I'd just add to this is, yes, absolutely. I think faith traditions and their parishes, all the local entities that are affiliated with them, have a role to play in this. But that goes for all of these civic associations. Again, under the concept of subsidiarity and other moral systems that recognize decentralized power, there is always a sense that there are some associations that are dangerous. In Madisonian terms, we would talk about this as factions, small groups of people who are actively working against the common good. And this is different than just people with different opinions fighting things out. There's some associations, some gatherings of people who, these people want violence. They want to divide us, and we need to do something about that. Something that associations used to do a whole lot more of, and Yuval Levin has written about this, is being unembarrassed about saying it is our duty to shape people so they work better in our institutions, but also, like in the Burkean sense, these little platoons shape people so they have solidarity at the local level, but also so they can go to the next level and participate in a broader community. And I would like to have more conversations about how all civic associations can shape people, especially young people, into better citizens. And that means obviously not just putting an end to this kind of political violence, but teaching people why the First Amendment matters, why civility matters, why accommodation matters, why public service, republicanism, Republican virtue matters, why compromise actually matters. And it's interesting, every time I write about this publicly, I get a lot of people yelling at me because they think that society is so broken, institutions are so broken, that defending the First Amendment or civility is just acquiescing to broken institutions.
Mhm.
So we have a whole lot of work to do to explain why these institutions and norms and values and systems that we've had for a long time, why they enable a pluralistic continental democratic republic founded in liberty to succeed. And I think we've lost the taste for that. And I'd like to see our civic institutions regain it.
I wanted to know if Theda, do you have any response to specifically the discussion about the challenge of a multiracial democracy being a real possibility or not? I think you have to unmute yourself, Theda. I'm sorry.
Of course, it's a possibility. America at its best has always taken people from everywhere, and while respecting their variety and benefiting from it, ultimately fostered their becoming Americans. And I think that process is continuing. I can say, as a teacher at Harvard and other universities over 50 years, my students now are a rainbow, but they don't strike me as fundamentally very different from the kinds of young people that I've always been teaching. And but I will tell you, I'm actually terrified about what's going on right now. And it's not about religion in particular, but there is a very powerful strand of fusion of belief that God is deciding things and that one has the right to support authoritarian methods, including violent methods, for attaining and retaining power that is growing in our country. And my research in recent years before the pandemic forced me as a woman in her 70s to sit on my couch for 2 years. I was out traveling. I was out more than ever before in my career, visiting various parts of the country and sitting down and talking with people across the entire spectrum. I suspect I'm one of the few people who's actually sat down with socialists and right-wing Christians in the same day for an interview in the same community, or attended a Tea Party meeting and a resistance meeting on successive days in the same community. And of course, I don't talk to them about each other because that's not what researchers do. That's not the way the rules work for academic research. But it all goes into my head, and I have to make some kind of sense about it before I can even go to sleep at night after those intense kinds of visits and interviews. Even before Donald Trump arrived in the White House, I had otherwise perfectly sensible Midwestern people, and I'm a Midwesterner by background, so I feel very comfortable around Midwesterners, telling me those people in Madison and Milwaukee didn't really have the right to have their votes counted, that something illegitimate was going on. Well, flash forward some years later, and we have laws being passed to make it hard not only for those people to vote, but for their votes to be counted fairly. And we have election officials of both political parties, including conservative Republicans in many places, being threatened with violence on the internet and in person because they want to follow the rules. Now, it's not all on the right. We have some very crazy things going on in academia. And I know the next one is about universities, but universities have a big role to play. And I have some positions on that that are not often considered politically correct by my generally left-leaning friends. But we are in a moment in which people who believe they're designated by God or by some other kind of moral absolutist truth that may be secular are willing to take very extreme measures against their fellow citizens. And America has been through periods of that in the past, but the biggest one was the Civil War and the end of Reconstruction, in which one side beat the other and enforced racial exclusion for decades upon decades. So we are in a very, very serious moment. And I'm not of the school of thought that says that just getting people together in local groups to talk about their feelings is going to solve that problem, because America is very segregated geographically. And most of these very dangerous divisions that we're talking about set metropolitan America against non-metropolitan America, not urban versus rural. That's too simple, because a lot of middle-sized cities are have gone to one side in this. But that is very dangerous, and we know that the American system is constructed in such a way that when extremes of ideology and of sorting by some major politicized social characteristic, such as immigration status or race, lines up with place and the way in which place shapes representation in the electoral system, we've got a formula for real danger. And we're in one of those periods. And what happened in Buffalo left me so shaken, I had a very hard time getting through the rest of the day. That young man came from a middle-class community. Where were his parents? Where were his neighbors? Where were all the people who read what he had to say as he laid out the detailed plans? Things are not working. And it's not just in inner cities where things are poor or rural areas where things are very poor that things are not working. They're not working in middle-class America either.
I'll just
sorry, I feel very strong.
I understand. I'll just add, and then we're getting some questions from the audience, but to follow on what Theda, you were just saying, I was to preach the Sunday after the Saturday Buffalo shooting. And before the service, a distinguished African-American woman, he's leader in a multiracial congregation, she came up to me, took me aside and said, I have a question for you. And I said, yes. And she said, Pastor, why do people hate me? We've got a question that follows on from what Theda was saying, and it's about Christian nationalism. The panelists have not so far addressed Christian nationalism, the movement to make this a white Christian nation. Does that fit into the discussion, and how? I wonder, I think Theda has already spoken to that, but I wonder if Andy or Dave want to give any perspective on that, on the development of this growing sense. And maybe any data that you have that really breaks down some of the numbers.
Yeah, I was going to say, I would love to know if Dave has data on this. Like, is this a 1% phenomenon, a 0.5% phenomenon, or more like a 25% phenomenon?
Well, those are all good questions. So let me actually thank the questioner for bringing up the topic of Christian nationalism. This is what I was alluding to earlier without naming it, when I was saying that there are, some religious organizations that work to heal racial divides and others that will inflame racial tensions, and the Christian nationalist movement is definitely an example of one on the side of those who inflame others. Now, one of the tricky things about a term like Christian nationalism is actually trying to pin down who exactly is a Christian nationalist. So to answer Andy's question, is it a 1% or a 25%? Well, it would depend on how you measure Christian nationalism. It's probably not as high as 25%, unless you define it very loosely in terms of people who believe that America is or should be or was a Christian nation. So if you just leave it at that term, that's actually a fairly high percentage of Americans. But that isn't really tapping into what we mean by Christian nationalism, which is a more virulent strain of this idea that America is to be a white country or a white Christian country specifically. That's a smaller percentage, but a non-negligible. I don't know if I can put a number on it, but it's certainly more than 1%. What's tricky about this is a lot of this is led by the rhetoric that you hear spoken either over the pulpit or increasingly on cable TV or through social
Fox News
media.
every
So
night.
so you may have had people who are sort of, well, I'm not really sure how I come down on this, but then they hear people that they respect espouse these views that sort of shift them or maybe crystallize a worldview that we would characterize as Christian nationalist. And then the more that gets repeated, the more that it gains some legitimacy. So it's very much a concern. And this is an example actually where religious leaders, because they are at the local level, can really play an important role of trying to tamp down that sense of America being a white Christian country. Because if you hear it being repeated on cable news, it's a lot harder to resist it. But if you hear sort of a counter programming from your local pastor, I think that could go a long way to diffusing what is just a tragic situation.
Andy?
Well, if I could expand the concern a little bit wider, this
Sure.
is just part of something that really concerns me, that on the left and the right, more than I ever thought I would see in my lifetime, there are groups of people who simply don't believe or profess not to believe in things that I just thought everyone assumed were foundational to American governing. So I'm going to paint with too broad a brush, but forgive me, like just for the categories, this can be helpful. I've run across a whole lot of young progressives who are not, say, with no embarrassment, that they think that free speech is actually just a way of perpetuating injustice, that we need to do away with the idea of free speech. Similarly, they think that there are like democratically legitimate laws. They'd be happy to overturn a whole bunch of them if they don't adhere to a concept of social justice. So the lack of faith, especially among young people, in democracy and free speech, I find really troubling. On the right, vaguely the right, there is, again, a growing number of people who talk about post-liberalism, including some scholars at some quite famous universities, who think that the Lockean tradition, even America's founding, was all wrong, that by prioritizing liberty, we ended up sowing the seeds for ultimately our ultimate discord. There are even people who write about right of center new theories of constitutional interpretation who speak derisively of positive law meaning democratically legitimate law coming through state legislatures or coming through Congress, because it does not adhere to their vision of the natural law. Again, these are more examples of people being against things that I thought were foundational. Us being a pluralistic nation, believing in democracy, believing in a wide array of liberties, that we should have a public square where we hash things out, that it's not just about rights, it's about accommodation and compromise. So I still can't tell if we're talking about just as loud voices representing 1% of the population who believe in this. If I were to trust Twitter or media, I would say that this is 90% of the population who's given up on some of these foundational things. All I know is it's a whole lot bigger than I ever imagined it would be. And this is what I'm concerned about, that for some reason, people just don't believe in these basics of American governing that I just assumed people would in perpetuity, because that's the only way that America can function.
Is it related to why CPAC is having an event in Hungary with Viktor Orban right now?
That topic deserves its own conversation. How what some of these European nations have done with their concept of solidarity and government power and post-liberal, like heightening democracy over liberties, how that has caught on some elements of the right. It is notable, again, something I didn't see coming 10 years ago.
Yeah, we've got a different kind of question from the audience, and it is interesting. It goes this way. Part of the issue is applying religious beliefs to individual decisions regarding abortion, issues around gender, sexuality, school, curriculum, and so forth. These personal choices are politicized by religious communities. Do religious communities need to integrate the inevitability of an ever-changing society into their engagement? In other words, I think the questioner is saying, don't religious communities need to do more to engage the kinds of changes that are going on within society at local levels around these issues, rather than just simply push back at them? I think that's what it's getting at. Do any of you have a response to that question from the audience? Maybe Dave and, well, any of the three of you.
Well, this is a tricky question. And I'm anticipating that there may be some disagreement on this panel about this, given what Andy was saying earlier about pluralism and such. My own view on this is that if you look at what religious institutions have done in the past, they have always accommodated and adapted to a changing social landscape in ways that have passed almost invisibly through the culture. An example would be the issue of divorce, which was once a very heated subject. Now it was just basically not discussed. And when it comes to LGBTQ rights, that's one where in some religious organizations that just isn't an issue anymore, because they're perfectly happy to accept LGBTQ people. And then of course there are other religions where that's still being fought out. My own view, just from someone sort of observing this, is this is inevitable, that there will probably always be some religious organizations that resist whatever social changes out there, just like there are some who don't accept divorce today, but that's a pretty small minority. That it's inevitable, but that doesn't mean that it's easy while we're reaching that inevitable conclusion. But others may disagree on that. I mean, I just look at various religious organizations, and I would say, particularly on the issue of LGBTQ rights, that is the one issue that young people find especially radioactive about religion. And that's one thing that will almost certainly drive young people away if they feel like a religious organization is not welcoming to people of various, wherever they land on the LGBTQ spectrum.
On the other hand, it is the issue that is causing more division within religious communities right now than any other, probably.
Yes.
Andy?
I guess the only thing I would add is, Hayek kind of got this right on all institutions that are worth their salt evolve over time, because we learn more over time. And so a tradition, properly understood, should never be sclerotic. It should continue to learn. And I'm averse to saying, like, get with the times, because there are a lot of faith traditions that got something right 1,000 years ago or 500 years ago, and society got things wrong. And so it's important to go back to these basic principles that you think that are most important: the sanctity of human life, protecting the innocent, whatever it might be. And not deviate, even if society tells you to. But there are also these instances. It brings me great pride that religious communities stood against the awful racial segregation in lots of places, and were helping lead a lot of the marches during the civil rights era. So faith communities certainly can be on the vanguard of kind of social change that's necessary. But I think all religions would probably say there are certain things in our creed that are non-negotiable. And I think that probably varies from not only faith to faith, but even inside of some faiths. You might have Methodists who disagree on some matters with Lutherans, with Catholics, and so on.
Yeah.
I'll just say, as somebody who teaches at a Catholic university, Catholics are certainly willing to disagree with one another.
Yeah.
I basically see it every day.
Yeah.
We've got one other question, which it may be a way of helping to ask each of you to bring some summary comments. But the questionnaire basically says this: so far you've been mostly speaking about religion as a victim of polarization, diminishing attendance in churches as something that has encouraged polarization. But are there ways in which religious bodies fostered polarization or other forms of division? Or are they just innocent bystanders? Now, I think you've already given some examples of how branches have maybe fostered polarization, but I'd like each of you to jump off of that question in saying more than just, are religious institutions, and I'd also say civil organizations, voluntary organizations, are we simply seeing how they are being victimized by the trends going on in polarizing society? Or in terms of the pillars of democracy framework, do you see ways in which religious and civil institutions really have a role to play in fostering the kind of vitality of democracy that is so much an issue now? So from each of your perspectives, perhaps you could address that. And maybe I'd go to Dave and then to Theda and then to Andy. Would that be all right?
Sure. On the narrow question, just to use the words of the questionnaire about whether or not religious organizations have been innocent bystanders in this, I would say largely no, actually. They've been complicit in it. And that's especially true for the movement known as the religious right. I think this was a very conscious decision made on the part of both political and religious leaders a generation ago, that they would be very explicit about the Republican Party's embrace of not just religion in general, but a very particular view of what religion ought to do in the public square and the policies that ought to be enacted on the basis of religious beliefs, and that they would exploit places of worship as sites of political mobilization. I think that was very explicit, and they are now reaping what they have sown from that. That doesn't mean that in every single case when there's a political dispute or something happens in a local congregation that kind of rips it apart, it isn't necessarily part of that larger national movement. We do have a lot of, everybody knows this, disagreements among many Americans, often within their own families over politics, and that can happen at the congregational level. But when you sort of look broadly, the kind of politicized religion that I'm describing, I think very much was a conscious decision, not the consequences of it, but the fact that, yes, we're going to marry religion and politics in order to exploit that, to win over people to one party. That didn't happen by accident. Right. Now, to the question of whether it's religion or other civil institutions can work to be true pillars of democracy, I still, and this, I guess I would echo what Andy was saying earlier when he noted that, there's still a lot of good stuff being done in American civil society. And I would say, yes, that is true. And that is true when it comes to religion. Most Americans do not attend an especially politicized church, and they don't go to church because they want to hear about politics. They go to church because they feel fulfilled there, because they find meaning there, because they believe in, that I'm saying church, but I should, congregation of all types. Right. And to the extent that religious leaders take their role seriously to try to foster a sense of democracy and not just promoting a partisan view, there's hope. And in my interactions with clergy, I actually find that is often the case. And they are very concerned about what's happening. They do not like the fact that religion is being mixed up with politics. So,
Theda?
Well, I think that I certainly have not been arguing that either religious associations or non-religious associations are innocent bystanders in anything.
Right.
They're both affected by and agents of whatever larger changes are unfolding. And I think it's hard for people, I know it's hard for my students often to wrap their minds around the fact that leaping to kind of moral judgment about trends is probably a mistake, because most organizations, most human beings have a mixture and most things that happen in society have a mixture of consequences that's very hard to sort out in any morally simplified way. I will say, though, that moral absolutisms of various kinds are on the march. Not all of them are religiously grounded or justified. Some of them actually are quite secular. And we're in a period of turbulence in America that, if you think about it in the long run, is not surprising. The United States has always had a period of nativist reaction against immigration at the end of periods of rapid immigration. The mid-19th century, the late 19th century, and we're in the aftermath of a period between 1965 and 2008 that really brought a lot of new people to the United States. And then you put that together with the playing out of the Civil Rights Revolution and the changing relations between Black and white in America, always a bedeviling set of things in our history. And pile on top of that, men and women's relationships changing, and the relationship of family to work changing. It's like a triple whammy. And some of the most morally absolutist reactionary movements, which are certainly carried in part by churches, but that also carried by very secular politicians. I mean, who could be more secular than Donald Trump? Give me a break. He may have been chosen by God, as some on the right believe, but he's not godly, not by any definition than any of us ever learned in our parishes or congregations. These reactions against these kinds of changes are sweeping the country, and some people want to impose all of the changes by some kind of political definition on everybody else as quickly as possible. And other people want to use minority political power, even violence, to resist those changes. All these associations that we've been talking about are partly involved in some of those tendencies, and partly they're fighting against them. So I find it very hard to generalize, and certainly to make any kind of universal condemnation or approbation of religion.
Okay. Andy, you started as the more optimistic voice, and you get the last word.
Well, on this point, I'll just say how I differ from some of my friends on the right, which is, I mean, I'm a dispositional conservative as much as I am an ideological one. And I believe that there is something about the conservative temperament, that we need to respect institutions and norms and tradition, because these things contain wisdom and they keep us together. When I write about things like institutions and norms and civility and accommodation, what I get often from folks on the right, including people who would identify themselves as very religious, is essentially, Andy, you are being naive, willfully blind, that our institutions have been taken over by forces that don't really have the common good in mind. The only way to save our institutions and to save the things that we believe in, they would say, is to fight hard. And so we, they would say, are not beginning these fights. We are not beginning this war. We are engaging because we have been forced to engage in these fights. And this is what makes the conversation so hard, and why it's, I think, so difficult to make progress when everybody believes that everyone else has started the culture war, and then they themselves are the ones who are on defense. Nothing is more dangerous when everybody feels like they're under attack. That's when you get the worst fights here. I don't know if that adds to it, but that's the thing that I'm most pessimistic about. Right. Everybody feeling like everyone else is attacking them and their beliefs.
And hopefully the best of religious institutions and voluntary civic institutions can provide a climate that helps people understand that that's not true. This has been a terrific discussion. I want to thank deeply Dave and Theda and Andy for your terrific contributions. All the work of your life that you've been doing has really just enriched our discussion here. I want to thank the audience for your participation, for your questions, and for listening. And I want to remind you who are in the audience, please do take a moment and fill out that survey that you'll get so that the Kluge Center can continue to develop these in the way that most meets your needs. I'm sure all of us want to extend at the end, as we did at the beginning, a real word of gratitude and thanks to the Kluge Center of the Library of Congress. This is an amazing institution that is really playing a role in trying to invigorate the life of the academic world and the world of government and institutions in a way that really is making a contribution to our civic life and to the atmosphere in Washington, D.C. as well. So thank you so much. And on behalf of the Kluge Center and of all three panelists and myself, I wish you a good day.